And welcome back to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me, as he always does, is Juan Zarate. He's our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you as always.
Bob, great seeing you.
So it's been a while since we've talked about what's going on in Hong Kong with the protesters there demanding more democratic reforms, a little bit more transparency in the government. Have they had any luck?
Well, they've had some luck, Bob. They've had a meeting with the chief executive, or at least a representative of the protesters had. That was one demand, to talk through potential reforms. But they haven't broken through the fundamental question of whether or not there's going to be a direct election of the chief executive of Hong Kong in 2017. The Hong Kong authorities are saying the ruling from Beijing still stands, and it will stand, which is that Beijing will vet the candidates and that those candidates will be the ones that propose themselves to the populace in Hong Kong in 2017. And so the protests continue. The size is not the size that we've seen before. These now seem to be driven by student activists, complemented perhaps at lunchtime at times by office workers. But it seems that the Hong Kong authorities and the Chinese are willing to wait this out and hope that it dies a slow death of its own attrition.
It may be hard to sustain a protest for a number of years.
That's right. Well, we've seen that with the Wall Street protests and all the other populist protests in the last couple of years. They eventually peter out. Either the weather gets to them, or lack of enthusiasm, or lack of progress in terms of their agenda.
Now let me ask you this. So they have a meeting, which I think was televised, wasn't it? They have a meeting with the authorities. Is that a victory in and of itself, that their voices were at least in a forum with the authorities?
Well, in a sense it is, because it's an accommodation by the authority. Certainly in the Chinese context, less the Hong Kong context, but the Chinese context, that's ceding to popular will and demand in a way that the central authority in Beijing would probably never countenance. Remember, this is the progenitor regime of Tiananmen Square, right? And so the fact that there is a bit of accommodation is something to be seen as a success for the protesters. That said, the protesters come from a democratic tradition, and they want what they want in terms of direct elections in 2017. They're not getting it. And so ultimately you have to ask the question, how far can they go, and what's the ultimate solution if both sides aren't willing to give? Bob, one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is China knows that the world is watching. They signed an agreement with the British and with the Hong Kong authorities that they were going to have one state, two systems. And whether or not that kind of regime can exist, and whether or not China can honor its commitments, is really at play here. And the Chinese know that, and so they're not going to overplay their hand, and it's why you haven't seen a lot of violence against the protesters. They're going to use a velvet glove on this situation.
At the same time, though, it seems very hard to envision real, true concessions, because if China acceded to those demands, they've got other problems.
Yeah, the converse is right. This is a mirror into China as well, because to the extent that they allow for greater openness, greater democracy, the rest of China is potentially affected as well. And so they've got to balance this out of Beijing to say, look, we don't want to break what we have with Hong Kong, but at the same time, we don't want to create a demonstration effect in Hong Kong that reverberates all throughout China, which is destabilizing. Beijing doesn't want instability. The other folks who are watching very closely, Bob, folks in Taiwan, because China ultimately wants unification, reunification with Taiwan. They probably would like to do it peacefully or through economic means. But if they're demonstrating that they're not willing to honor a one-state, two-system model, that could chill any attempts at rapprochement with the Taiwanese authorities and people.
Very delicate dance there, to be sure.
Absolutely.
Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.